Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of the Let's Create Black Ops Zombies series. Before we get started, I'm going to show you what we're going to be making in the next couple of episodes. So this is the final result with the gun. We have weapon sway, we have recoil, bullet effects, reloading, ammo counts, and just some shooting that feels really good and natural. So let's get started. So I created a new first-person project, and the first thing I did is opened the player character and deleted the mesh, the gun, the sphere, and the VR components, pretty much everything. Delete the spawn projectile /VR code /construction script code. I'm also going to delete the code inside the HUD since the crosshair is not actually centered on our screen and it's going to confuse me. I did, however, add my own HUD with just a little dot in the center just for reference. So first thing we're going to do is go into the marketplace and we're going to add the Fps Weapon Bundle. It's in the permanently free collection, so it's a free asset, but much more preferably you could use your own gun assets if you have some. So create a new actor called Weapon_Master, add a skeletal mesh called Gun, create a child class called Weapon_AR4. We're going to mainly be working with this gun. Put AR4_X as skeletal mesh. This pack provides the guns facing both Y and X. We're going to want the ones that are facing the X direction. Open the first person character, add a scene component called weapon placement, and make it a child of the camera. I'm going to move it to 2020 -20 because my guns look good in that spot, and we're going to create a function called equip weapon, give it an input weapon class of type Weapon_Master. Call a spawn actor from the class with the input as class. Next we have to spawn it in the correct position, so get the weapon's placement transform. Promote the spawned actor to a variable, equipped weapon. Then we want to get the actor to component node. The parent is going to be the weapon placement, and we want to keep world for all three parameters. We're going to create the input 1 and call the function equip weapon AR4. So now if we test it, if we hit 1, the AR4 appears on our body and it follows us. Wonderful. So before we start to work on firing weapons will work pretty differently for automatic and single fire weapons, so create an enum called E fire type, and we want to add two values, single fire and automatic. In Weapon Master, add a fire type variable, and in the child class for the AR4, we're actually going to set it to single fire to do that code first, but we're going to change it to auto fire after. So back in the first person character, create a function called fire weapon, create switch off fire type, and use the equipped weapon's fire type as its input. Off of single fire, we want to call a line trace by channel, and we're just going to do the regular camera input with its world position and forward vector. And I'm going to make the line reach 10,000. We're going to turn the debug onto duration so we can see where we're firing. Now back in the event graph, we want to create a left mouse button call. And first we want to ask if the equipped weapon is valid, and if it is, call fire weapon. Now if we test it, every time we click we can see that it creates a line trace right where the center of our screen is. Alright, next we want to create some recoil, so create a custom event called recoil, add a timeline, make it 1 second long, and we want to play it from start. In the timeline, add a float track going from 0 to 1 and change it to auto interpolation. We don't want our recoil to take an entire second, of course. We're going to adjust this amount per weapon. Off update, get player controller, and add set control rotation. For X and Z, we just want to get the control rotation from the player controller, but for Y, we want to get a lerp with the alpha as the alpha output. A will be the Y value of get control rotation, but we need to convert it so the computer doesn't get confused when we go from 0 to 360. So take a select from the A value. The index will be if Y is greater than 180. If false, directly put in Y. But if it's true, take Y minus 360. Collapse all this math into a macro and we'll call it convert pitch. B will be the converted pitch plus 0.4. Add a yaw input and just make it a random float from -0.15 to 0.15. And let's call recoil at the end of fire weapon and test it now. It works, but we don't want to use these recoil values to be the same for every single gun. So go into the Weapon Master and create 3 float variables. Recoil amount, which I set to 0.4, recoil yaw, which I set to 0.15, and recoil length, which I set to 0.03. Plug those values into the first-person character, recoil amount for the B value of lerp, recoil yaw for max, recoil yaw times -1 for minimum. Now, before the timeline, get the recoil timeline and set the play rate to 1 divided by the recoil length. We also want to set our camera to go back down after we're done shooting, so create a float variable called previous pitch and put it in a no edit category. create a boolean called can reset previous pitch and put that in the no edit category as well. In the fire weapon function in the beginning, ask if we can reset the previous pitch. If true, set the previous pitch to get the Y from the get control rotation and convert that pitch, and set the reset previous pitch to be false, and then continue on to the switch to fire type. If the bool is false, just continue on to the fire type. Create a new custom event called pull down recoil, and we only want to do this if our recoil is higher than our previous pitch because we don't want our camera to pull up after shooting. If true, create a new timeline called pull down timeline. I'm going to hard code this to be 0.18 seconds, but you could use the same method of changing the play rate per gun. Create a float track going from 0 to 1 and auto interpret. Off update set control rotation and get the control rotation for X and Z. Y is going to be a lerp with alpha as alpha. A is going to be get control rotation Y and convert the pitch, and then B will be the previous pitch. Off finish, we can set the previous pitch to be true. We also want to pull down automatic weapons after we stop shooting. Off left mouse button release, check if the equipped weapon is valid, switch on fire type, and then off automatic, pull down recoil. For single fire weapons, we want it after every shot. So off finished on the recoil timeline, switch off fire type if single, pull down recoil. We also want our gun to pull back as an animation, so create a function in the weapon master called set recoil variables, take the gun's relative rotation, and promote the Y value to a variable called pre-recoil rotation. Take the Y plus 5, promote that to a variable called recoil rotation amount, and then promote the 5 to a variable called recoil amount. Now we're going to do the same for location. Take the gun's relative rotation, promote the X to a variable called pre-recoil location, take X plus 5, promote that to a recoil rotation amount, promote that 5 to a variable called pullback amount, but multiply it by -1 before adding it. So create another function called recoil animation. We want it to have a float input called alpha. In it, set the gun relative rotation, and we want to get the gun relative rotation for X and Z, but for Y, we want to pull a lerp. Pre-recoil rotation will be A, recoil rotation apex will be B, alpha will go into alpha, set relative location to relative location, Y and Z. Off X, pull off a lerp, alpha to input, A is pre-recoil location, and B is recoil location apex. In the first-person character event graph, before the recoil timeline, add a sequence. Off then 1, make a second timeline called recoil animation timeline. Make it 0.2 seconds, add a float track. We want it to go from 0, then to 1, then to 0, and auto-interpret that as well. Off the update, we want to call another sequence. Off of then 1, we want to do once node, which will set the recoil variables from the equipped weapon. And then off the then 1, the recoil animation. We want to call recoil animation from the equipped weapon. And then when the timeline finishes, we want to reset the do once node. So let's go ahead and test that recoil. Okay, looks good, but we also want to make sure automatic weapons fire correctly. So in Weapon Master, create a variable called fire rate and default it to 0.1. In the AR4, let's change it to automatic. And due to previous testing, I'm also going to set the recoil amount to 1 and the pullback amount to 3 and the fire rate to 0.083. Go to Fire Weapon, and let's collapse the single fire nodes into a function called Fire Trace. Off automatic, set a timer by function name, and the function name will be automatic fire. For the time, we want the equipped fire rate, and let's set loopings to true. Let's promote the return value of the timer to a variable called automatic fire timer, and create a function with the same name as the timer, automatic fire. We also want to call this automatic fire function before we call the timer, so it doesn't wait the fire rate amount of time before firing the first bullet. So back in the function, let's call fire trace, and that's the only thing we need to do for now. In the event graph, on left mouse button released, after we pull down the recoil, we want to check if the automatic fire timer is valid, and if it is, we want to clear and invalidate the timer so it stops shooting. So let's go ahead and test that, and it works. And also the fire rate is working, but there is one workaround. If you can click faster than the fire rate, you can fire as fast as you can click. This is more adamant on single fire weapons. To test this, I'll make the AR fire rate 2 seconds, and single fire, as you can see, I can shoot every 2 seconds, or I could just spam my mouse and shoot forever. So to fix this, we gotta add a gate between the is valid and the fire weapon off the left mouse button press. We want to uncheck start closed, we want it to start open. After we call fire weapon, we want to create a sequence. Then 0 will close the gate. Then 1 will call a re-triggerable delay with the equipped weapon's fire rate as its duration, and then after that, open the gate again. Now we can only shoot every 2 seconds. Let's collapse all this gate code into a macro called fire macro, and lastly, let's add some bullet spread. So go into the weapon master and add a float called bullet spread and default it to 250. In the fire trace function, add a vector plus vector between the end math plus start math, and add the right vector times a random float in range of the bullet spread, and then the minimum will be that times -1. So do the same for the up vector. I'm going to undo the recoil to demonstrate because it'll be easier to tell. And now you can see when we shoot, there is some bullet spread. And let's make sure to put recoil back before we end. And before we end the tutorial, I created the other weapons as well by duplicating the AR4 weapon 4 times and naming them after their guns. And make sure you update their skeletal meshes and their variables. So this is the variables I set to these. I know it's not accurate to the real life equivalent of these weapons, but these are some values I created to have a diverse type of weapons to work with. Also, before you go, make sure to check out the Discord, because usually there's just some small bug that I overlook, and that's usually where I end up posting those solutions. So that's all for this tutorial, and I will see you in the next one. Darling,